Hello, this is SK Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about monarchy. More specifically, I would like to talk to you about attitudes towards monarchy in American politics, especially since the term monarch has been bantied about quite often in American political discourse in the last few years. Normally in the negative. What I mean by that is, I was watching Anglican TV, and I like Anglican TV. I'm not criticizing it, but on Anglican TV, Kevin Carlson was being a bit critical of Obama. I'm not going to give you the context. You can watch the episode yourself. It is episode 606. And again, this is not an overall attack on Kevin Carlson. It is simply a criticism of something he said specifically. And that is that Obama would often go against the courts or against Congress and say he doesn't need Congress for this. And then he said, Obama, the people are complaining about Trump, but Obama was almost a monarch. Thus, he was essentially saying Obama was acting like a monarch because he thought he could do whatever he wanted and didn't need congressional approval. The system of checks and balances inherent in a democratic society were being ignored by Obama as if he was a king and could do what he wants. Because, as we all know, under a monarchy, the king's word is law, and he doesn't get permission from anyone else. The same sort of thought is often done by those who don't like President Trump. They will often say that he is acting like a king or acting like a monarch. And recently, Tucker Carlson on Fox talked about the Republic of Chaz, the autonomous zone within Seattle that has declared itself independent and has elected its first president, this rapper whose name escapes me at the moment, and I've decided not to look it up because it's irrelevant. And he said that one day that guy was just an aspiring rapist, and today he's a monarch! And of course, Carlson was making the same point. This guy has unchecked absolute power. He's a monarch, not a republic. This bothers me. For you see, I'm actually a monarchist. And no, I'm not a monarchist because I think I should be king and everyone should do what I say. I would be fine if someone else was the king and I was under them. But I'm not a monarchist because I believe in dictatorship, or absolute power being given to one person, or having a system in which one man holds all the power and there are no checks and balances. Which sounds strange. Why would you be a monarchist who believes in checks and balances? By definition, a monarchy gives all power to the king and there's no checks at all. Checks and balances exist in democratic governments like what America's founders gave. In fact, America fought a revolution to get away from the absolute power of a king and created a system of checks and balances precisely because they saw the abuses that monarchy gave under the tyranny of King George III. And this is, of course, a common narrative as well, that King George III was an absolute monarch. I've recently had a conversation in the YouTube comment section, in fact, that referred to King George III as an absolute monarch. But King George III was not an absolute monarch, did not rule by decree, and actually operated in a system of checks and balances well before the American Revolution. You see, it simply isn't true that under the monarchy the power of government was vested solely in one man, the king, and there were no checks and balances, and this led to abuse and tyranny and oppression, and America's founders saw that and said, no more! Fought a revolution for our freedom, and once they created their new government, abolished not only the tyranny of King George III, but the tyranny of kings in general, giving us a republic, and realizing power concentrated in the hands of one man is wrong, and thus, through their brilliance, came up with the concept of checks and balances, which republics have and monarchies don't. America's founding fathers did not invent the concept of checks and balances in governments. The idea of checks and balances was already present in British government for centuries before the American Revolution. King George III himself wasn't even allowed to select his own ministers. Calling him an absolute monarch, or pretending he ruled by decree, may justify having a republican form of government and a belief in democracy over monarchy, especially if you operate under the narrative that the king abused his power and was tyrannical, and there was nothing that could stop him simply because he was the king and could do what he wanted. But it is not real history. You can actually have a monarchy in which there are checks and balances. What's more, a republican form of government will often be corrupt. The idea that a republican form of government will have little to no corruption, so if there is corruption in our government is acting like a monarchy, well, you're basically saying if it's corrupt, it's monarchy, if it's not corrupt, it's not, which is rather silly. It's rather like those atheists who say it is impossible to be an atheist and be religious, who then claim communism as a form of religion because it killed people. You're defining it very poorly. Monarchy is not chiefly defined by the amount of power given to someone. Monarchy is not about giving absolute power to one man. Indeed, monarchy is not actually a form of government, but rather a form of state, describing the general arrangement of how the government is instituted. It doesn't really tell you who runs it or what its constitution is. A form of state would be things more broad than that. A form of state is a republic, a monarchy, an aristocracy, an oligarchy, but doesn't go into the details of how this operates. With monarchy, you can have anything from a purely symbolic monarch who has no political power at all to an absolute monarch whose word is law, as people are imagining. But most monarchists these days tend to envision a traditional monarchy along European lines, in which the monarch serves as an executive, but does not have legislative power. This is especially true in the English-speaking world, where we use the British model. Historically, the king held the executive power. He was commander-in-chief of the military. He was over all the government agencies. And of course, his signature was needed for something to pass into law. They called this royal assent. But the king could not write new laws, and the king could not raise taxes. It's rather like in America with the president. The king had basically the same limits. There are differences. The king, for instance, can declare war, though Parliament reserves the right to not fund that war. So it's always best to get parliamentary approval for a war, but the king can declare war on his own, whereas the President of the United States can't. However, the king didn't have absolute power, and as a monarchist, I don't want a king that does absolute power. And ultimately, while this video isn't about why people are monarchists or the typical monarchist mentality, I do find it odd when conservatives would talk about monarchists as if they are liberals or want a socialist state, when the socialist groups and the left wing are what destroyed monarchy. I also find it odd that left-wingers would continuously point to people they don't like as monarchs, but it makes a little more sense with them since the left-wing narrative is about anti-authoritarianism. Of course, conservatives might say that the left is not anti-authoritarian, it is pro-authoritarian, and they wish to institute authoritarian governments, but I said their narrative, how they frame it to themselves, not what they actually are. So that's a different topic. Which is also not saying they actually are totalitarians. I'm not discussing that at this point. But what I am discussing is how odd it is that we use the term monarchy as a slur to demonize people we don't like, as if monarchy is just inherently bad. And while we often treat the defining characteristic of monarchy as absolute power, we really tend to think the defining trait of monarchy is vague evil, vague tyranny of some sort. And monarchy isn't really about tyranny either. Monarchy is no more or less tyrannical than a republic on its own. Now, as a monarchist, I would argue that republics tend to become tyrannical more often than monarchies, and that this is endemic to the nature of republics. But just on the surface of it, just flatly, there is no reason to think that a monarchy will be more likely to be tyrannical than a republic. And on a surface level reading, just hearing what kind of government they are, you wouldn't necessarily assume that of a republic either. So in reality, I really dislike this idea of calling people you don't like monarchs or monarchy. And as a monarchist, I really resent being placed into the categories that people personally don't like. Well, I don't have much else to say. This post is a bit rambling, but I'll come back again one day. Until then, a thank you, God bless, and goodbye.